Elena Parker's life began to unravel on a winter night that seemed ordinary at first. The snow outside the small wooden house fell in heavy silence, and inside, the warm light of the fireplace cast long shadows on the walls. Her newborn son, Luke, slept in a small crib by the window. Daniel, her husband, had come home later than usual, smelling faintly of alcohol and cold air. For months, the tension between them had been building in ways that Elena couldn't quite put into words. Daniel's charm, the same one that had once made her feel safe and loved, had soured into something unpredictable. His smiles had turned sharp, his voice carried a constant edge, and his eyes no longer softened when they looked at her. That night, the argument began over something trivial, a misplaced bill, a forgotten errand, but it quickly escalated. Daniel's voice rose, and Elena could see the anger in him swell like a tide. She tried to quiet him, afraid the noise would wake Luke, but her efforts only seemed to provoke him further. His words grew cruel, cutting into her with a precision that suggested this wasn't anger born in the moment, but a resentment he had been feeding for some time. Then, without warning, his temper spilled over into violence. A shove sent her stumbling against the table, the sharp corner biting into her hip. She gasped, not from the pain, but from the realization that the man she had trusted with her life was capable of breaking it without hesitation. When it was over, Daniel stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes avoiding hers as if ashamed, though not enough to apologize. Instead, he turned away, muttering something under his breath, and walked into the cold night. Elena stood frozen, her hands trembling, the room suddenly feeling much larger and emptier than before. The crackle of the fireplace seemed mocking now, its warmth unable to reach her. She looked toward Luke's crib, her heart aching with the knowledge that the man who had just left was his father. Days passed in a strange fog. Daniel returned briefly, not to make amends, but to gather some of his belongings. There was no talk of reconciliation. He left with most of their savings, and without a backward glance. No note, no promise of support, just silence in the place where a marriage had once been. Elena, now alone with her infant son, was left to face the heavy weight of what had happened. The bruises on her body would fade, but the ones left in. Her mind began to take on a different shape, something colder, more deliberate. The first weeks were filled with survival. She took odd jobs, sold jewelry, and accepted help from neighbors who pitied the young mother abandoned with nothing. At night, when the house was quiet and Luke was asleep, Elena would stare into the darkness, her mind replaying that night over and over. Each time, the scene shifted slightly, not in the events, but in how she saw them. At first, it was fear and sadness. Then it became anger. And soon after, it became something else entirely, a quiet, calculated thought about what it would take to make Daniel feel the same helplessness he had left her with. That she told herself it wasn't revenge she was thinking about. She was just imagining a world where people like Daniel didn't get away with walking out on their family. But in the deep, hidden parts of her mind, she knew the truth. She wanted him to feel pain. Not in a momentary flash of guilt, but in a way that would cling to him for the rest of his life, the way his actions had clung to her. And that thought became the seed of something that would grow quietly, hidden from everyone. For years. In the months that followed, Elena began to shape her life around that seed. Every decision, no matter how small, was made with two goals in mind: survival and preparation. She never spoke Daniel's name to Luke, not out of mercy, but because she believed that silence would be more powerful. One day, she told herself, her son would learn everything. And when that day came, she wanted him to feel the truth as sharply as she had felt it the night his father left. She didn't yet know how it would happen or when, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Daniel's betrayal had not been the end of their story. It had been the beginning. And in that quiet, relentless truth, Elena found a strange kind of comfort. The years ahead would not erase her pain, but they would give her time to turn her grief into something far more dangerous. Time to plan. Time to wait. Time to make sure that when the moment finally came, it would be a moment Daniel never saw coming. Elena learned quickly how to hide the darker parts of herself beneath the routines of everyday life. To the outside world, she was simply a single mother doing her best, holding down part-time jobs, keeping the small house in order, and raising her son with care. But beneath the surface, her mind was always working, building a mental map that revolved around Daniel. She never called him, never wrote, never gave any signs she still thought about him. Yet every so often, she would hear his name in passing or catch a glimpse of someone who looked like him in a crowd, and it would ignite the quiet fire she carried inside. In the early years, she kept her focus on Luke, using every moment to teach him skills she knew would matter later. She encouraged him to read, to study people's expressions, to stay calm even when others tried to provoke him. She made games out of observing strangers in the park, asking him what he thought they were feeling or where they might be going. Luke, young and eager to please, absorbed it all without question. To him, these were just lessons from his mother. But to Elena, they were bricks in the foundation of something far greater. As Luke grew older, Elena began gathering information about Daniel in small, careful steps. A casual question to an old acquaintance might reveal what city he had moved to. A quick visit to the county records office could uncover his new address or employment history. She learned how to search quietly, never leaving a trail that could lead back to her. She kept a notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting, dates, places, observations, even habits she remembered from their time together. Daniel's life unfolded on those pages like a map she was slowly drawing. Piece by piece, the more she learned, the more she realized he had built a comfortable life for himself. He had remarried, lived in a well-kept home in a pleasant neighborhood, and worked a steady job. He moved freely in the world as if the past had never happened, as if the night he left had been nothing more than a forgotten argument. That knowledge didn't weaken her resolve, it hardened it. She didn't want to simply confront him. She wanted him to lose everything the way she had. Luke never saw the notebook during those years. Elena kept it locked in a box beneath her bed, knowing that the time wasn't right. She believed that certain truths, once revealed, would change a person forever. She wanted Luke to be ready before he heard them. So instead of telling him, she shaped him. She taught him to think ahead, to weigh his actions, to prepare for outcomes before making a move. She trained him to keep his emotions in check, to never show anger unless it served a purpose. Every lesson was wrapped in the language of life skills, but each one was sharpened for the day she would finally reveal its true use. On the outside, life settled into a rhythm. Luke excelled in school, earned respect from teachers, and became known as someone dependable. Elena smiled at the compliments, knowing they were only seeing the surface. Beneath it, Luke was becoming something else entirely, a boy molded not just by love, but by the deliberate hand of a mother who carried a hidden agenda. Years slipped by, and Elena kept her plans quiet, her patience unwavering. She knew that revenge was not something to rush. It needed to be precise, timed perfectly, and carried out in a way that left no trace. As Luke approached adulthood, she began to sense the moment drawing closer. The foundation she had been building for so long was nearly complete, and the thought of it filled her with a calm certainty. 18 years was a long time to wait, but she understood now that the waiting was part of the power. When the time came, Daniel wouldn't see it coming, not from her, and not from the son he had abandoned. By the time Luke turned 18, he had become everything Elena had quietly worked toward. He was disciplined, intelligent, and unshakably composed. Years of her subtle guidance had left him with an ability to think strategically, to read situations, and to act without hesitation when the time was right. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that made people trust him easily. To his friends, he was reliable. To his teachers, he was promising. And to Elena, he was the culmination of nearly 2 decades of planning. It was on his 18th birthday that she decided the time had come. The years of waiting, teaching, and shaping had been leading to this single moment. She prepared the evening carefully, making sure the house was quiet, the curtains drawn, and the locked box retrieved from its place under her bed. When she set it down on the kitchen table, Luke noticed the weight of it, not just in its heaviness, but in the way it seemed to carry a kind of finality. When the lock clicked open, the contents told a story that Luke had never heard in full. Page after page revealed Daniel's life in precise detail. Addresses, phone numbers, photographs, and notes on his routines. Tucked among the papers were records of financial transactions, copies of public documents, and even maps marked with red ink. At the bottom lay a single, faded photograph of a young couple holding a newborn. The only time Luke had ever seen his father's face. Elena didn't need to embellish. The facts alone were enough to change the way Luke saw his childhood. She told him the truth about the night Daniel had left, the years of silence, and the way she had been forced to rebuild from nothing. Her voice was steady, without anger, but beneath her calm, Luke could feel the weight of everything she had endured. For a long time after she finished, he said nothing. He only stared at the photograph, the image of a man who had shaped his life by absence alone. From that night onward, Luke began to see the world differently. The lessons his mother had given him took on a new meaning. The emphasis on patience was not just about staying calm, it was about waiting for the right moment to strike. The importance of reading people was not just to get along, it was to understand how to control the situation. Every bit of discipline she had instilled in him was now sharpened into something with a purpose. Elena didn't force the next steps on him. She simply left the notebook in his possession, telling him only that he should read it carefully and decide for himself what it meant. But she knew him well enough to understand that the decision had already been made in his mind. Luke was her son, shaped by her values, molded by her teachings, and now armed with the truth. In the weeks that followed, Luke began to study the notebook in detail. He memorized the addresses, recognized patterns in Daniel's routines, and noted the times when his father was most isolated. He didn't act immediately. Instead, he watched from a distance, traveling to Daniel's city under the pretense of school projects or weekend trips with friends. He learned the layout of Daniel's neighborhood, the position of streetlights, the timing of traffic on the surrounding roads. Every observation was stored in his mind with the precision of someone who understood the stakes. Luke's visits remained unnoticed. Daniel never once suspected that the young man standing quietly in the corner of a coffee shop or walking past him on the street was his own son. Luke moved with the ease of a stranger, careful not to linger or draw attention. The anonymity gave him an advantage, one that he intended to keep until the very end. Back at home, Elena watched him without interference. She saw how his movements had changed, how his eyes carried a new focus. She recognized in him the same controlled patience she had nurtured for years, now blooming into something far more dangerous. She didn't need to ask what he planned to do. She could see it in the way he carried himself, as if he were already walking toward a conclusion. Only he could see. The bond between them deepened in silence. They spoke of ordinary things, but each conversation felt layered with an unspoken understanding. The years of preparation had brought them to this point, and now the pieces were in place. Luke was no longer the boy she had raised to be ready. He was the man who would carry out the ending she had imagined on a cold winter night so many years ago. Luke's quiet observation of his father soon turned into a precise plan. He had learned Daniel's habits well enough to predict them without hesitation. Most nights, Daniel stayed home, but on Fridays, he followed the same pattern. He would leave work, stop by a small neighborhood bar, and stay until closing. He drank just enough to dull his awareness, then walked home along a dimly lit side Street. It was a routine so predictable that Luke knew he could rely on it without fail. He didn't rush. Weeks turned into months as he tested the boundaries, following from different angles, making sure no one noticed him, studying the timing of the traffic and the way shadows stretched under the streetlights. He looked for cameras, escape routes, and quiet places where the sound of footsteps wouldn't carry. The city offered plenty of noise, but the stretch between the bar and Daniel's house was almost eerily silent at night. Luke waited for the right evening, one when the weather would keep most people indoors. A cold front settled in late that winter, coating the streets with frost. On the chosen night, he positioned himself ahead of time, blending into the darkness near an alley that intersected Daniel's path. In his pocket was a folded piece of paper with an address written in his mother's handwriting, a detail he intended to leave behind. It was the address of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Daniel left the bar later than usual, his pace unsteady, his coat collar turned up against the biting wind. Luke followed at a measured distance, his steps muffled by the thin layer of snow that had begun to fall. When Daniel reached his car, Luke slipped the note under the windshield wiper and disappeared into the shadows. From there, he watched. It took a moment, but eventually, Daniel noticed the paper. He hesitated, glancing around, but saw no one. After a moment's pause, he climbed into his car and drove off in the direction of the warehouse. Luke took a separate route, arriving first and letting himself inside through a side entrance where the lock had long since rusted away. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of oil and dust. The dim overhead lights flickered weakly, casting shifting shadows on the cracked concrete floor. He moved to the far side of the building and waited, the silence wrapping around him like a second skin. The sound of an engine approaching broke the stillness. Moments later, Daniel's footsteps echoed against the walls, tentative at first, then more deliberate. His silhouette appeared in the doorway, outlined by the faint glow of the streetlight outside. He stepped inside, scanning the room with a cautious expression. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud. Luke had made sure it could be locked from the inside, and now the faint metallic click seemed to seal the air between them. "Daniel," called out once, his voice bouncing off the walls, but received no answer. He took another step forward, his shoes scraping against the floor. Luke didn't rush toward him. He let the silence do the work, letting the tension settle until every sound seemed louder than it should be. The shadows made it impossible for Daniel to see clearly, and each flicker of the light above seemed to shift the room's shape. The time Daniel realized something was wrong, there was nowhere left for him to go. That night, no one passing outside the warehouse would have noticed anything unusual. The building had been abandoned for years, and the cold kept the streets empty. Whatever happened inside stayed hidden from the world. When Luke left, he did so without looking back, the warehouse falling silent once more, its flickering lights casting no witness to what had taken place within. By morning, the warehouse stood silent, its rusted doors closed against the bitter wind. A thin layer of frost covered the ground outside, masking any trace of movement from the night before. Daniel's car was the only thing that broke the stillness. It sat parked a few feet from the entrance, its windows clouded with condensation, as if it had been left in a hurry. Passersby noticed it, but in a city where abandoned vehicles weren't uncommon, no one thought much of it until late afternoon. That was when a concerned shop owner from across the street called the police. When officers arrived, they found the driver's seat empty, the keys still in the ignition. The glove compartment had been rifled through, though nothing appeared to be missing. Inside the warehouse, the dim light revealed signs that someone had been there recently, faint shoe prints in the dust, a tipped-over chair, and scuff marks on the concrete floor. In the center of the far wall, taped at eye level, was a single photograph. It was worn at the edges, the colors faded with age, but the image was unmistakable, a young woman cradling a newborn. both looking directly into the camera. The photograph puzzled investigators. There was no blood, no obvious signs of violence, and no explanation for why Daniel's car had been left outside. The warehouse offered no clues about where he might have gone or why. It was as if he had simply stepped into the shadows and vanished. Search for Daniel began immediately. His wife reported him missing, insisting it was unlike him to disappear without contact. Police questioned his co-workers, his neighbors, and anyone who might have seen him the night before. The bar owner remembered him leaving alone, just after midnight. A patron mentioned seeing him pull a note from under his windshield wiper before driving away. But no one could recall what was written on it or where he had gone. Days turned into weeks. The warehouse was searched repeatedly, but each visit revealed the same scene. The photograph still taped to the wall, untouched since the night it had been found. Forensic teams lifted fingerprints from the car, but none matched anyone in the system except for Daniel's own. The address on the folded note remained unknown. No one had seen it, and no copy was ever recovered. Meanwhile, Elena kept her life exactly as it had always been. She went to work, kept her home in order, and spoke to neighbors in the same calm, polite tone she always had. If she noticed the missing person posters beginning to fade on telephone poles around town, she gave no sign. To anyone who asked, she claimed not to have spoken to Daniel in nearly 2 decades, which was the truth in the most literal sense. What she didn't say, what she would never say, was that the silence between them had been carefully cultivated for this exact ending. Luke was gone too. His friends assumed he had moved for work or school, as young men often did, and no one questioned it too deeply. Elena allowed the rumors to grow on their own. The fewer direct answers she gave, the less there was to connect her to anything that had happened. In the privacy of her home, she removed the notebook from its box for the first time in weeks. The pages were as orderly as the day she had given it to Luke, though now it was no longer a plan. It was a record of something completed. As months passed, the case went cold. Without evidence of a crime, Daniel's disappearance became one more unsolved mystery in the city's records. His wife eventually moved away, his house was sold, and his name slowly faded from conversation. But in quiet corners, the story still circulated, always with a hint of something darker behind it. Some claimed he had run from debts. Others believed it was a robbery gone wrong. A few whispered that it had been personal, though no one could agree on who might have wanted him gone. For Elena, there was no need to dwell on speculation. She knew exactly what had happened. She had known it would end this way from the moment she had felt the cold corner of the table against her side all those years ago. The 18 years in between had been nothing more than preparation, a slow, deliberate process that had turned grief into focus, focus into patience, and patience into action. The truth would never be written in a police report or spoken in a courtroom. It existed only between mother and son, bound by silence and the knowledge that some debts are not paid in money, but in time. Elena had waited, and Luke had delivered. The rest of the world could call it a mystery, but for them, it was simply the closing of a story that had begun the night Daniel walked away.